It's great to have everyone here at today's open Zoom session on how the CPLAN and DIME models work. Ko Charlie Keeling Aho. I'm a senior advisor in the communications and engagement team, and I'll be taking us through this session today. But first, we have Bevan Hunter, Principal Advisor in our Corporate Services team, who has been working on our internal capability here at the Commission. We're really happy to have Bevan lead us into this session with a karakia. Kia ora, Bevan.
Kia ora. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou I runga I te pāka whakaata reo nei, anei hi karakia tīmata. Poipoi a te Māori, poipoi a te Wairua, poipoi a te tapu, poipoi a te whenua o Papa Tuanuku. So for those of us who speak English, it's nourish the life force, nourish the spirit, nourish the sacredness, and nourish the lands of Mother Earth. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Bevan, thank you. So before I tell you a little bit more about what we've been up to here at the Commission, it'd be really great, as usual, if you're used to these sessions, if you could tell us your name and the organisation or community you represent while I continue speaking. And it'd be great to see where you're joining us from in Aotearoa as well, since we can't see your actual faces. While you're doing that, I'll give you a quick update. So as you're all definitely will be aware by now, we obviously released our draft advice outlining what Aotearoa could do to reach its climate targets on the 31st of January. And at 9 AM on the 1st of February, our consultation on our draft advice opened to the public. So that means this is your opportunity to make a submission and tell us what you think about our mahi. I'll post a link to the consultation page in the chat at the end of the session. It's important to remember that we're really open to changing our advice to reflect what we hear during consultation period. So we're really keen to hear from you and are looking forward to finding out your thoughts on our advice. Today you'll be hearing from our expert team and Principal Analyst Anita King, who will be taking us through the presentation today. You'll be able to ask questions during the session, and you should see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your questions. We won't have time to get to all questions, but we'll do as many as we can, and it'd be great if you can ensure they're not too technical to make sure that we can have a good discussion during the session. If you do want to speak to each other or share your thoughts, as always, feel free to use the chat. We love seeing what conversation is going on throughout the session. So for now, that's enough from me. I'll hand over to Anita, who'll be kicking us off. Thank you, Anita.
Okay, welcome everyone. Ko Anita King Aho. I'm a Principal Analyst working on modelling here at the Commission, and I'll be doing the presenting today, but when it comes to the Q&A session, we've also got Professor Niven Winchester of Auckland University of Technology and Motu, who built the CPLAN model here to help out, and Dr. Lynn Riggs, who built of Motu, and she built the DIME model. So the presentation today is going to be in 3 sections. Let me just check I've got this working. Give us a moment. I think we're just getting control transferred for changing the slides. Are you able to change the slides for me, please, Amy? Thank you. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to talk a bit about our modelling system, how our modellings fit into our overall analysis, how we're using them and that sort of thing. And I'll talk a little bit about all the models we're working with so that you can see where things fit in. Some of our there's one model in particular that I'm not going to talk much about today, but it's important to know a little bit about it, to know why things aren't included in the models I am going to talk about. I'll then go on and I'll talk quite a bit about the CPLAN model and explain what that is, how that works. And then I'll talk about the DIME model, which is the other model we have that looks at impacts and focusing on employment. And after each of these sections, I'll pause and leave time for questions. Next slide. So first of all, our modelling system, the Commission's models, and a bit about how we actually use them. Okay, next slide. So we've got a number of models in-house. We've got 3 big models. We've got the ENDS model, the CPLAN model, and the DIME model. And then we've got some sectoral submodels, I guess you could call them, that feed into ENDS. ENDS is about a bottom-up model with a lot of technological richness. CPLAN talks more about wider economic effects, and the DIME model goes into how effects on employment are distributed. Next slide, please. And so today we're just focusing on CPLAN and DIME models, and that's because these are the models that we've used in our impacts work, and we've used these in a different way to how we've used ENDS. ENDS has been the subject of at least one, I think several other webinars that we've been giving. Okay, next slide. So in a little bit more detail about how the parts of the system are linked, the ENDS model is about what's possible. So it's a bottom-up model where we put in a huge amount of technological and economic detail, a lot of richness. So instead of just having EVs in that model, we also have, information about battery costs and that sort of thing. We use ENDS, as well as for a lot of the work on setting the budgets, we use ENDS to provide calibration data to the CPLAN model. And the CPLAN model is about answering the question, what's the impact? And in particular, what's the impact on New Zealand's economy as a whole and on individual sectors? As part of the information we get out of CPLAN is employment data, and we feed that into the DIME model, and that helps us answer the question about who's affected. And at the moment, where our model primarily focuses on employment, in the longer term, we hope to change that, but there's only been so much we've been able to do in the months we've had that we've been doing this work so far. Okay, next slide, please. I think it's also useful to explain how we think of models in general, how we use them. And certainly for me, the key thing about a model is that it gives us the logical results of our assumptions. So we put a set of assumptions in and we see what the logical results are. Now, sometimes they won't match reality, and we need to be able to understand what assumptions have led to that. And then that can help us question that assumption and decide whether it's a realistic one or not. It also means that the value of a model has a lot to do with how we get to the answer, often more than what answer we got. So the precise number that we get out of our models is not going to be something that we expect to be right or anything like that. But how we got to that number, why the model came out with that answer, is really important for us understanding what's going on. The other thing I'd also mention is that models, by design, they simplify reality. And this is a feature, not a bug. Reality is a very complex thing. I'm sure most of you have noticed. And so it can be too complex sometimes to get a handle on. But if we simplify things, if we try to take into account what we think are the most important things for the question we're asking, then we can make better progress and understand things better. Okay, next slide. So how do we use the CPLAN model and the DIME model? First of all, we decide our scenarios and budgets. And this is an important thing for me to mention, because these particular models are not telling us what the budget should be. We are telling these models what we think the budgets would be. So we put the budgets into the model as constraints. We say, as part of what you need to do, model, you need to meet this restriction on our emissions. And then we see what implications come out of the models, come out of CPLAN, come out of DIME, and also out of our other analysis. And we ask the question, do we think that's appropriate, or do we need to revisit the budget numbers we're suggesting? And so then we can iterate back up, try a different budget and see what happens if we see what the models tell us about the implications of those budgets. Now, the other thing to mention, these models are new. Niven and Lynn have been working on the code, Niven till I think it was about September last year, and he's still been doing some fine tuning since. We were still getting results from DIME at the beginning of this year, like a couple of weeks before we were releasing our reports. And we're only just learning how to make the best of them. We're confident in the results that we've put out. Those are the results that we have understood, made sense, and that sort of thing. But we haven't got to understanding all the corners of the model. That's also why we've got Niven and Lynn on the call today to help us with some of the finer details. Okay, next slide, please. Right, and the final word for this section is about data sources. So all models need data. Our data comes from a wide variety of sources, and we want to be as transparent and open as we can. We want to make sure we're using the same sort of things as everybody else. So as much as possible, we try to use publicly available data. There are a couple of places where the data is not publicly available and we don't have the rights to make it publicly available. A lot of the data that we use for CPLAN that is sort of self-consistent and it's has international data as well as New Zealand data, that is created or put together by a consortium at Purdue University in the US known as GTAP, and we pay quite a few thousands of dollars to get access to that data. Anyone else is free to go and pay the thousands of dollars and will also be able to access that data so long as you're willing to pay the money. The other data set that we don't have control over in terms of being able to release is the microdata that we use for the distribution model. This is in Statistics New Zealand's data lab, and this is data that comes from surveys, and it's got a lot of individual data points that can tell you a lot about any individual person if you don't obey the confidentiality rules. So stats have very strict rules around that for obvious reasons. We don't want that sort of data to be, or they don't want that sort of data to be freely available for lots of reasons. However, a lot of organisations, a lot of universities and the like are able to access the data lab and then they can see the same data. Okay, I think here is a good time to pause and take a few questions.
Hi Anita, we haven't actually got heaps of questions yet, so it might be good to just plough on and we can have a longer break for questions later, if that's okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next thing we'll talk about is CPLAN, and this is probably going to be the longest and most technical section, but hopefully I will be able to make it understandable for everyone. And I'm going to start by talking about CGE models in general. While some of you who are listening into this call probably know what a CGE model is and the like, there'll be others of you who I'm sure will be as mystified as I was when I first came across the term 10, 15 years ago. So I'll go through that and then I'll talk about the particulars of CPLAN and what makes it different to other models. I'm not going to go into really deep detail because we've got a limited time for speaking today and there's only so far you can get, especially when you're starting at the very beginning. Okay, so next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, just a second, I'll just a minor technology issue here. All right, so CGE stands for Computable General Equilibrium. Now the computable bit just means it can be calculated on a computer. When these models were first being designed several decades ago, that was a big deal. The general equilibrium side of things, it's a more economics term, this one, and this is about where the supply and the demand, we're about finding the price in the economy that means that supply and demand match each other for every single sector. So if you've got a very simple economy that has TV manufacturing and hairdressers in it, then if your economy is in equilibrium, then there are no TVs sitting around in warehouses waiting to be sold. There's nobody sitting at home saying, I've got all this money and I wish I had a TV, but I just can't get my hands on one. And then same for haircuts. So, you know, no hairdressers standing around going, I'd like to cut someone's hair, but there's nobody to do. Or the alternative situation of someone sitting at home, I've got all this money to pay for a haircut and I really want a haircut and there's just no hairdressers to give me one. So when you've got general equilibrium, you don't have any of those situations. Now, CGE model is an economy-wide model. So it takes in every single sector in the economy and it balances, it has a production side and a household side, so a supply side and a demand side, and it's balancing those. It's really good at showing the flow-on effects of changes. So, for example, if you are thinking about dairy farming and you have a change that affects dairy farming, positive or negative, a CGE model will then allow you to see how that change flows through to the milk processing industry and to supermarkets and the like. But it will also let you see how those effects flow through to the demand for fertiliser. And that's all assuming you've got the right sectors in there, of course. But it can do that's the sort of thing that it can do. It's also used a lot more for what if questions rather than for forecasting. So what if our carbon budgets are really generous? What if they're really tough? It's not about saying we expect that the world will look like this in 10 years' time. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so a really simple CGE model has these features. It's got a representative household, and that household has people in it who want to buy stuff. And in order to buy stuff, they need to get money. So they're willing to go out and work to earn some money. They may also have some savings that they are willing to lend to some manufacturers for the right interest rate. And that again gives them another source of income. They're trying to maximize what the economists call utility. And that basically just means they're trying to make themselves as happy as possible from their work, their renting out their money, and their purchases of things. On the other side of the equation, I guess you could say, you've got two sectors, and you'd need at least two because otherwise your model doesn't do anything exciting. It's pretty boring. But if you've got at least two sectors that span the whole economy, those sectors, they want to hire people to help them work for them. They want to borrow that money so they can buy machines, and they make stuff and they sell that to the representative household. And they're trying to make as much money as they can. So if our two sectors, imagining that all our economy involved was TVs and haircuts, then we've got the TV manufacturers who want to hire some people to put the TVs together. We've got the hairdressing sector that wants to hire some hairdressers. We've also got the TV manufacturers. They want to borrow some money to buy their machines to put the TVs together, their soldering irons or whatever else. The hairdressers need to have their scissors and their chairs. They make their goods and they sell them on to the household. And then the one other thing there is there's a market in there, which helps find that price where the amount that people are willing to supply and the amount that they want to buy is equal, so that we don't have any of that extra supply or extra demand in the model. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so getting on to CPLAN specifically now. So CPLAN, obviously, it's quite a bit more complicated than that very simple model I presented before, but that gives you a good starting place. So the CPLAN model is a recursive dynamic model. And what that means is we take that little model, we've expanded it out, we've got a few more sectors in it in CPLAN. We solve it in 2014. Then we do some stuff like taking account of depreciation and things like that to step it forward to the next year. And then we solve it again for 2015. And we keep going all the way up to 2050. So that's what that means, recursive dynamic. And that gives us results for every year. It's also a multi-region model. So again, thinking of that simplest model that I talked about before, expanding it for those extra sectors, we solve that in New Zealand. And we solve that in the rest of the world. We could solve that in a bunch of other countries as well, but we just got two sectors in this model. And then we allow trade between those two regions so that we can have imports and exports. And that's kind of important for what we do, because it means that we can see that we're not just importing embodied emissions instead of producing them in New Zealand. CPLAN, we've got more than 30 sectors in that model. Exactly how many sectors depends on what you count as a sector and what you don't. And the things that we use, the things that we feed into the model as what you can use to make stuff with is labour and capital, like I talked about in the simplest model. We also have land for our agricultural sectors and forestry. And we have resources. A good example of where resources comes in is for the fishing industry. We limit the number of fish in the sea that we can pull out. So that's the CPLAN model. Next slide, please. And I know we've had a few questions in some of our previous things about how the ETS works in CPLAN. And this is quite important because it drives a lot of the behaviour. And the first thing, perhaps the most important thing to take away from the slide, is that what we've got in CPLAN is not a representation of New Zealand's real ETS scheme. There's a lot of differences between the two. that mean that we are not modelling New Zealand scheme in there. It's what we've got as an ETS and CPLAN is basically, it's just a way to find a price that reduces the emissions in the model. And a price is important for this type of model. It's one of the things that it basically hinges on. So what we do have, the way it works, we've got two separate caps in the model. One is for biogenic methane, so that's your methane from agriculture and waste, and another cap for basically everything else, the long-lived gases, and those are the ones that have got to get to net zero. And that means that we end up with two separate prices because we've basically got two separate ETS schemes. Forestry is not included in either of these schemes. And there's a couple of reasons for that. There's the technical reason where, because to include forestry and its removals, you need to start putting negative numbers into there. That actually screws up the maths. It makes it a lot harder. The non-technical reason is that in some of the other modelling that's been done by the Ministry for Primary Industries and that sort of thing, the indication is that at a relatively modest carbon price, you end up with forestry across the whole of New Zealand, every square inch of the land covered by forestry. Now, this is one of those things that we think is quite unrealistic. It's not an assumption we want to put in our model. So instead, we decide outside the model how much the removals are going to be and feed them into CPLAN. We do have a free allocation of units included in CPLAN. Generally, we've tried to line that up with what we've got in the policy, what's happening in New Zealand at the moment, but I don't think we have it exactly the same. So that's how we get a carbon price in CPLAN. Okay, next slide, please. So how do we get emissions reductions? So in our CGE model, we don't usually put too much in the way of explicit technologies. That's why we have the ENS model that has all that technological richness. However, in CPLAN, we've got a number of the ones that we think are most crucial for our emissions reductions in New Zealand. So we've got EVs in there. We've got methane reducing technology for agriculture. We've got biomass and electrification for process heat. So that's the sort of heat that Fonterra use when they're doing what they do with the milk, with the raw milk and that sort of thing. And we've also got carbon capture and storage for geothermal electricity. So that gives us some options for reducing emissions in terms of technology. We also have the ability to fuel switch in the model. So you can switch between using petrol and using electricity for your cars. There's also price-driven energy efficiency. And the way to think about how this works is to, if you imagine heating your home with a bar heater, which is cheap to buy, but it uses quite a bit of electricity, compared to a heat pump, which is much more expensive to buy, but uses much less electricity. So there, you're substituting between how much your purchase cost is, so that's effectively the capital, and how much energy you're using. And depending on the relative prices of those, which one you're more likely to go for. And so we can get, if the electricity gets more expensive, then we're going to have more people moving away from bar heaters and towards heat pumps. We also can add a certain amount of energy efficiency and reducing emissions intensity as an input into the model. And remember when I said before about a recursive dynamic model where we solved in 1 year and then we step to the next year. When we do that step, we can say, actually, our technology is just that little bit better. Each year it gets that little bit better, that little bit more efficient, and we can decide by how much that is. And that allows us to account for things that we can't specify explicitly, either because there's just too much detail or because we don't necessarily know what the innovation, for example, looks like. It allows us to take account of that. And if we don't, then we tend to be over pessimistic because there is a general march towards being more efficient through time. And then finally, if all else fails, and it usually is if all else fails, we can reduce the output from whichever sector is heavily emitting. And you'll often see, if you see a steep price rise or a very high level of emissions price coming out of a CGE model, that's often an indication that what's happened is the model's run out of other options and it is now reducing output from that particular from the particular sectors. There will be a little bit of reducing output or changing output. It could go either way when we've got the explicit technologies and other things going on. But most sectors, most of the time, we don't reduce output in a very, or output doesn't reduce in the model very strongly until we've run out of other options. Okay, so next slide, please. All right, now this is the last slide for CPLAN. It's also the most technical, but this is explaining how we produce stuff in the model. So what we do when we model this, we say, right, we've got this much, we've got land, we've got labour, we've got employment, we've got other bits and pieces. We feed them into a mathematical function and we spit out whatever we're producing. So for example, if I go back to the TV sector, and just for the record, I've never been to a TV factory and I know nothing about the process for manufacturing TVs. But say we're trying to make TVs. So our produced good or service, what we've got at the top of the diagram there, is the TV itself. Now, anywhere where you see two lines joining in the sort of upside down V, you can, or more than two lines, you can switch between those things. And they're not a one-for-one substitution, but you can switch between them to some extent. So if we're making TVs, our intermediate goods and services, that would be things like the circuit boards that need to go into the TV, the plastic casing, all that sort of thing. And then on the right-hand side, we've got this capital, labour, energy agglomerate. And if we carry on down the right-hand side, we've got value added, we've got capital and labour. So labour, obviously, that's the electronics technicians who are putting together the TV. Capital is going to be around the TV factory. You can switch between those. You might have a very labour-intensive factory where you've got a whole bunch of technicians out there with their soldering irons, one by one, putting the bits together. Or you might have a much more capital-intensive factory where it's all automated and you've got one or two people ready to stop the machines if there's a spanner in the works. Now, as well as capital and labour, we use energy, if nothing else to run the light bulbs in the factory, but more than likely to run a lot of the machines and things like that. Our energy can come from electricity or non-electricity. If it's not electricity, it can come from your various fossil fuels. It can come from biomass, if we're talking about process heat. And we've also got heat electrification in this category as well. And then electricity, we get it from a bunch of different sources. And all these things here that you can see at the bottom of the diagram, the hydro, the coal, the gas, they all have their own production functions that feed in to them. So they're all produced goods as well. Now, not every sector works quite like this in CPLAN, but this is the general idea of how they all work. So that's what I'm going to say about CPLAN today. So I think now's another chance to open it up for questions again.
Sorry, Anita. I was just looking through all the questions, and we've had some great questions coming through, so thank you, everyone. And let me just have a look which one to select first. So we've got a question here about data sources and confidentiality. Are you able to talk a bit more about the data sources and confidentiality surrounding them?
I guess I can. So we've got a range of data sources. Some of them are, for example, the fourth biennial report that was put out by MFE in 2019. So we use a lot of the same data that's used in that report, and that's publicly available. We use the greenhouse gas inventory, that sort of thing. Specifically on the microdata. So microdata is little individual pieces. So it's one person's answer to one survey question is one piece of microdata. And so in the stats, at Stats New Zealand, they have data like that for all their surveys. They have what's called the IDI, the Integrated Data Infrastructure, I think that is. And that takes a lot of those survey data, pieces of data, and it also takes data from IRD and Ministry of Health and that sort of thing, and combines it all together so that researchers can use that data set. Now, researchers then do a lot of manipulation of that data, and they will use it to find trends. They'll use it to find all sorts of other things. And Lynn, I'll probably get you to fill in afterwards a little bit more on this too. So they use it to find a lot of trends and that sort of thing, and also to slice and dice the data in a way that is useful for them. You then bundle it up into groups, and those groups, they have to be large enough, have to be of a certain size for two reasons. One, if you're trying to do statistical analysis, you need a large enough group so that randomness is averaged out. So there's the statistical reason. There's also the confidentiality reason, where if you have too small a group, you can identify individuals in that group. And that is certainly considered a very bad thing, definitely from Stats New Zealand's perspective, and they've got a lot of good reasons for that. So we have to make sure that things are presented in such a way that nobody can be identified from the data that leaves the data lab and goes public. Lynn, did you want to add to that?
Sure. We did look into originally getting using the publicly available employment lead data. And there were some key sectors, especially coal mining and oil and gas, that were all aggregated together. So it wasn't as feasible as we had hoped to use the publicly available data. So we used the microdata, but we are able to confidentialize a lot of the outputs and put together enough meaningful information on the outside that we can do get some nice results and compare different outcomes using the more detailed data within the data lab.
And I think I'd also just add, if you're interested in access to the data lab, then you go on the Stats New Zealand website and they've got something that talks about using microdata there. And you can apply to get access, and you have to show that you're a bona fide researcher, that you've got the appropriate skills for using the data. And you're also not allowed to use the data for strictly commercial purposes. So anything that you use the data for has got to end up being research that gets published in the public domain.
Thank you, guys. That was great. I've got a couple of linked ones here that I'll ask. So on the ETS, do you use the price elasticity information between 2014 to 2019 to understand how effective an ETS could be in delivering the 2050 target? And more broadly, presumably you use the data for 2014 to 19 to give you sensitivity information about the difference between the model and the real world. For example, are there biases in this model? What did you learn when you did this?
Okay, so for time reasons, we've been quite limited on the sensitivity analysis we've been able to do. Like I say, we were only getting some of the results out late last year, and we've then had to write a lot of them up and check that we understand the results and that sort of thing. I think in terms of elasticities, I need to pass this one on to you, Niven.
Okay, thanks, Anita. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great.
Yes.
Yeah, so in terms of elasticity, some models talk about an elasticity between, say, emissions and GDP. CPLAN, being a CGE model, is a little more detailed than that, in that the relationship between emissions and GDP depends on all the underlying production structures, such as that the ones that Anita went through, so in all the new technologies in there. So there is an implicit sort of some relationship between GDP and emissions and the carbon price, but that changes over time, largely due to the new technologies that come in. So we do have some sort of, this is what the economy is doing now, and these are the options that we have now in terms of fuel switching and energy efficiency improvements. But if we look at, for example, our assumptions for dairy and beef and sheep, we have methane vaccine/inhibitor technologies becoming available that aren't available before something like 1930. So that relationship between, say, carbon price and emissions, if we have an implicit overall elasticity, that's going to change over time.
one of the things I should also mention is that we have compared the results that we get out of CPLAN with the actual numbers for that time frame, about 2014 to 2019. And we've also compared the results with ends. And we're comfortable, they're not in perfect alignment, and we wouldn't expect them to be, but we're comfortable with the alignment we've got. We've got reasonably close in a lot of places.
Thank you both. I'm just going to ask Karen to jump on just to answer this one. Kia ora, Karen. So we've got one here that says, completely agree that a key part of the model is how we got to the answer. Noting an article in the Herald, is the modelling meaningful unless the model is publicly available for others to understand that how? Thanks, Karen.
Well, thanks, Charlie. Yes, so we have actually had requests to release our models, and we're working through those requests at the moment. What I would say is we're really confident in our models. We've been really lucky to have Niven Winchester, who's a world leader in CGE modelling, to develop CPLAN. We've been able to draw on other international experts. So we've had experts at the EU Commission and the modellers there, experts at MIT, Resources for the Future. We've also had New Zealand experts working with us in an expert modelling group. The other thing that we've also done is we've had our models peer reviewed, and those reviews are available on our website. All our results and assumptions are on the website as well. And we're also having a number of open Zooms to make sure that we can get the information out there, as well as other meetings with stakeholders who request them. So I can provide some of the links to those resources for you all in the chat.
Thanks, Karen. That was good. I've just got a couple more before we move on to the next section that I'll just ask. Just bear with me 1 second. So we've got one here. Are you counting CO2 from biomass as a gross emission or assuming it to be net neutral? In which case, do you have a corresponding adjustment in the forestry model?
I think we're taking it as net neutral, but I will pass this one to Niven as well.
Yes, we're just taking a net neutral approach there. So there's no credits or deficits for bioenergy in the model.
Thanks, guys. We've got another one here. I'm curious why employment impacts at the aggregate level aren't reported in any year. Can any of you respond to that?
Yeah, so the way the model works is that the aggregate employment, there is basically no unemployment in the model. So we can't use this to determine how employment changes across all of New Zealand, across the whole economy. But we can see how employment changes between different sectors. So one sector may employ more people, one sector may employ less people. And that's what we've based a lot of the DIME stuff on. And Niven and Lynn, feel free to add to that.
You all good? I'll just ask one more. There's a couple of linked ones before. I'm conscious of time, so we can move on to the next section and have more time for questions at the end. But these two, I think, would be good for Paul if you're happy to just jump on and answer. And we've got the first question is, why does the free allocation of units used in CPLAN not match current policy? And the second one is, regarding your free allocation, do you dynamically model reductions in the free allocations? If so, what are the effects of faster reductions?
Yeah, kia ora koutou. So on the first one, we do, for our current policy reference scenario in the CPLAN modelling, we did align with what's currently legislated around free allocation and the phase out over time. For our target consistent scenarios, we increased the rate of free of reduction in the free allocation in the future in order that we didn't sort of have over allocation happening in relation to the targets, because that can cause some funky things to happen within the model. So the we did, the final thing to say is, we didn't sort of explore the sensitivity to different rates of free allocation because we just didn't have time to explore all those kind of sensitivities, but it would be an interesting thing for the future potentially.
Thanks, Paul. I'll hand back over to Anita now for the next bit of the presentation.
Okay, so the last section, I'm going to talk a little bit about the DIME model and just give an overview of how this one works. So next slide, please. So at a high level, what the DIME model does is it takes the employment results from CPLAN and we see how how employment changes by sector. And then as the second step, we simulate worker jobs to find out the characteristics of the affected people. So things like their ethnicity, their region, their age, their education level, that sort of thing. And this thing, worker jobs, it's just a combination of workers and jobs. So me working at the Climate Change Commission is one worker job. If I leave the Climate Change Commission and go and work somewhere else, that's a different worker job. If I've left and someone comes and fills my job, then that's a different worker job as well. So in that second case, where someone fills my job, different worker, same job, but a different worker job. If I've left and taken another job, that's a different job, even though it's the same worker. And so again, that's a different worker job. And that's just around making the, how we can work with the data that we've got. So next slide, please. So the first thing we do is we look at those changes in employment. So we start with employment changes by sector from CPLAN. Now CPLAN, because our main data source is the international database GTAB, that uses different sectors to what the Stats New Zealand data does. So one of the things that we've had to work with a lot with our models is converting from one set of sector definitions to a different set. And so for this, the first thing we do with our CPLAN results is we convert them to the system that's used by Stats New Zealand, which is called ANZIC. And then we ask the question for each year, is employment in the sector growing or shrinking? So that's the absolute change. Is it employing more people or not? And then the other thing we do is we look at whether or not employment is changing faster than what we call our current policy reference. So if you've been looking through our reports, you'll have seen this come up in the context of CPLAN and DIME models. The current policy reference is our scenario where we take the policies that the government's got today, put them through our model and see what happens. Now that scenario, we don't meet our emissions targets, but it gives us an idea of which direction we're pointing now. And so when we get our results from CPLAN, we compare them to this policy reference and we can see not only is it growing in absolute terms, but is it growing more or less than the current policy reference scenario. So that gives us an idea of whether we've got growth happening in a relative sense or not. And then we ask the question, how many worker jobs are affected? So we find out how big the sector is in 2014. We take that change for each year, and then we can combine those two pieces of information to know how many how many worker jobs are affected for each sector in each year. Okay, next slide, please. So in the second part of the model, this is where we do our simulation. And first of all, we need to collect a couple of pieces of information, well, a couple of sets of information. The first one is, what do workers in each industry look like? Where do they live? What's their ethnicity? How old are they? What do they earn? But also how these characteristics are interrelated. If they're a younger worker, does that mean that they're also earning less in this industry? So that's one set of information that we put together. The other set is around how many people are affected. And we're using this compared to the current policy reference scenario. And the reason for that is we're just focusing on that difference rather than simulating each scenario, because if we simulate each scenario, we end up with millions of extra computations and we'd still be sitting here waiting for it to solve. So let's say we're talking about the old favourite for this talk, the TV industry. And let's say there's 10 people. We've gained 10 jobs in that industry in whatever year we're talking about, compared to the policy reference. So maybe it's a growing industry and maybe it's growing faster in the scenario. So next slide, please. So if we've got 10 people affected in the TV industry, then what we do is we create a new simulated worker for each of those 10 people. And that person will look like a worker in that industry. So if we know that half the workers in the industry are female, then our person, each of our 10 simulated people, each of them has a 50% chance of being female. If we know that 20% of workers in the industry are in their 40s, then our workers, our simulated workers, have a 20% chance of being in their 40s. Once we've got that for all our industries, we then add it all together so that we can get a whole of economy. You know, we've got this many people affected, and we can ask questions like, how many people live in Auckland that are affected? How many people are Māori that are affected? How many people only have a secondary school education? Now, because of the confidentiality requirements we've talked a little bit about and things like that, and also the statistical requirements, we can't ask all these questions at once. We can only ask one at a time because otherwise our samples end up too small and not helpful. The other thing we do, once we've done that, we then repeat this simulation 1,000 times. If you pull 10 people out of the hat, then you will get quite a bit of randomness in there. But if you repeat this 1,000 times, then you get rid of a lot of that randomness, and that gives us a lot better results, a lot better quality results. So that's what allows us to find out and answer questions about how employment effects are distributed. And so that is pretty much what I have to say about the DIME model. So if we move to the next slide, and I think we're time to open up for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Anita. That was great. We've got a few here, so I'll just start going through them. We've got one here from Bryce. What is assumed about the international carbon price to 2050?
So the international carbon price, we do a fairly simple assumption because remembering we're combining, 190 odd or however many countries there are in the world into one other region. So we have a very simplistic policy, and it is basically that we draw a straight line from, I think it's zero now, Niven, you'd need to confirm this for me, up to US $250 a tonne in 2050, and basically draw a straight line for the prices in between.
Thank you, Anita. Did anyone else have anything to add, or we can move on to the next one? We have another one here. So there seems to be a disconnect between saying that CPLAN won't model forestry because of negative numbers, but then to say it would cover New Zealand with trees. Can you please address that?
Okay, so the idea about it would cover New Zealand with trees, that comes from a different model, is the simple answer. And so we don't try and feed it too much into CPLAN. We do have forestry as a sector in CPLAN, but the amount it removes is something that we feed into the model, and the amount of land that it uses is something we feed into the model, which then means that that pretty much predetermines how much labour and capital and the like that it uses within narrow margins.
Thank you. We've got on here, it's claimed that carbon prices are not ETS prices. So who in the model is exposed to the carbon price?
So let me just think about that for a moment. So the carbon price, so there's a lot of different ways we can have carbon prices. And some of them you will see in real life, some of them you will only see in the model here. Carbon prices is kind of an umbrella term in this sense. So you can get a carbon price by choosing to apply a tax. That's what we do basically for the rest of the world in CPLAN. It's also what we do in the in the current policy reference scenario. Another way you can get a price is you can use an ETS scheme where you just say, this is the amount that we're going to emit, and what is the price that would allow the economy to adjust to get it. We've got basically two versions of that in CPLAN. One version covers, I believe it's pretty much everything that emits biogenic methane. So that is your agricultural sectors and your waste. We have to make a few assumptions around that because some parts of the model aren't quite fine-grained enough to do that really well. And then we've got another one for all the other sectors. Niven will probably have to come in on the fine details of this, or Paul, but I'm pretty sure that anything that emits greenhouse gases is covered by one or other of those schemes in CPLAN. But some of those sectors do also get some free allocation of permits. That's more closely related than a tax to what we have in New Zealand in real life. But what we have in New Zealand in real life is a ETS scheme that has a lot of policy intricacies to it that I'm not up to speed with. And the person who's most up to speed from the Commission isn't actually on the call today. I think she's in Gisborne or somewhere. But it's things like there is a cap and a floor. There's a lot of rules about who has to measure their emissions and things like that. A lot of details that we can't put into the CPLAN model.
Thank you, Anita. I don't know, Niven, if you had anything to add to that, but I've got another question for you now. So we've got one here. Is all land use decided outside of the model?
Yeah, so land use is predetermined how much land use there is for dairy, beef and sheep, horticulture, other animal products, and forestry. And hopefully I've remembered those off the top of my head. Those are fed into the model. I'm pretty sure land can't be switched between sectors.
Did you have anything to add to that, Niven, before I move on to the next one? Or
I just confirm that both those are correct. Every type of emissions is subject to one of the ETS policies or one of the carbon prices in the model. So everyone is exposed to a carbon price. And yes, land use change in the current functionality is all exogenous in the model.
Thank you. We've got one more that I might ask you, Niven, as well, while we've got you on the screen. Given the long-term changes you are looking at, are the substitution elasticities in your constant elasticity of substitutionness changing over time? And if so, what is the change depending on?
Well, it looks like you're frozen, Niven.
I'm not sure if we've lost.
So the short answer is no, they're not changing over time. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, now we can, yeah.
Right. So the short answer is no, they're not changing over time. And you're right. If you have a very short-term focused model, you'll just have this nested constant elasticity of substitution structure that Anita went through, and that gives you limited options to abate emissions. So if you're looking at the next sort of 5 years, perhaps that's quite reasonable to do it. But as the question alluded to, we're looking at long timeframes. So that's why we have the new technologies in there. So as Anita mentioned, if we're producing energy use by, say, the iron and steel sector, they can get that the way they're doing it now through fossil fuels, or there's ability to use some electrification, there's the ability to use biomass, and they're perfect substitutes that come in at a specified cost. So we're not locked into what we're doing now with just some little changes according to the elasticity function. So overall flexibility in the economy is changing through time, but we're not changing those elasticities in the production functions.
Thank you, Niven. And we've got time for a few more, so I'll just whiz through these ones. Has CPLAN accounted for changes in New Zealand's population out to 2050? If so, what different migration scenarios have been considered?
We've only used one set of population changes, and I don't think that they're not in the model explicitly. It's more implicitly in terms of the GDP growth that we've calibrated to. We haven't tested any other scenarios. There's a lot of sensitivity analysis we need to do, we would love to do, and we just need more hours in the day.
Thank you. I've got another one here. Thanks for the presentation. Given that the CPLAN model is based on the assumption of full employment, so resources being at full capacity, how precise is it to softly link that to your DIME model for capturing the distributional effects? I'm not sure if that's one for Niven and Lynn, or...
Yeah, I'm wondering if that's maybe a good one.
Yeah. I'm happy to take a first crack at this. So you said full employment assumption. Some people a little bit uncomfortable with that full employment assumption initially, but no, we're not modeling, say, in a surprise that happens next year, where people have made their decisions, have made where they're going to live, what degrees they've got, and all of a sudden something changes on them. We're looking at a policy over 30 years that's well signaled. So we're, people just aren't becoming coal miners anymore because they know that, coal is going to be a fuel of the past. So when we think of it in those changes, we're looking in those terms, we're looking over time, in that these well signaled changes are happening. We will have, but it's not unreasonable to assume full employment, but we're just going to be employed in different sectors than we would if we went down this path of climate policy is never going to be a thing. So people make the decisions based on that. People make the decisions with a very different outlook of the future. And Lynn can probably add to that with the dime.
Yeah, and that's why we really try to focus on the change between the reference policy and the different pathways. So it's really informing about the different choices that are made under the different pathways. So we can see if we do one particular policy on one pathway, what are the employment effects, and how does that then get distributed across the different ethnicities or genders or regions. So it's really that difference between the two, or the comparison to the main policy, that gives us the information that tells us about the different pathways and how they compare to each other. And I think that's really the strength of the DIM model.
And I think one thing I would add to that is just that what the DIME model allows us to do is to answer the question, or to get some feel for the question, the answer to whether or not the people that are losing the jobs are going to be able to easily transfer into the sectors that are gaining jobs or not. So if they have similar characteristics, we can assume that there's a half decent chance that they'll be able to swap. But if all the jobs are being lost in one region by people of one ethnicity, one age, one gender, and all the jobs being created are somewhere completely different with a much higher, perhaps, education level and various other things, then we know that we're going to have something that we need to deal with in some way, shape or form.
I know we've only got a few minutes left. I'm just going to quickly ask this one if we can have a short answer, and then I'll close us off. But how does CPLAN model investment in long-lived assets, for example, power station capacity?
You're welcome to take that one, Devon.
Yeah, so it does have, it does account for that. So it has a vintage capital structure. So we have some capital that was invested many years ago that we start with, and we're locked into that. And also the capital that we put in place now, most of that is going to be locked into a particular industry. So we have this vintage capital structure, and so we can have stranded assets. So if we shut down our coal-fired power plant, we've got a bunch of capital in there that can't all of a sudden become a wind farm or something else. So that sits around and doesn't produce anything, and the owners of that capital receive zero income. They are explicitly accounting for those long-lived investments.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists for expertly answering those questions, and Anita for the great presentation. I'm just going to post a link to the consultation site in the chat. As I said earlier, we're really keen to hear from you during this period. And we did have a question about whether the slides and recording will be made available online, and the answer is yes. Karen posted a link to our events page in the chat earlier in the session. So that would be where you'd have to go to look at the recording. We'll get it up as soon as we can. And so just to close us off, I'm going to ask Bevan to come back for the karakia. Kia ora, Bevan.
Tēnā koutou moa koutou tini whakaaro me ngā awhina I tukua mai hei tautoko I tā tātou hui me te kaupapa nei. So thank you all for your many views, your questions, interactions, the time invested in this kaupapa. Anei hi karakia whakamutunga. Kia tātou katoa, te ata whai o tō tātou ariki a ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga o te wairua tapu ake āmini. Thank you.